The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, Chapter 9, Part 2. The Hobbit barrels out of bond. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarfs, and indeed he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up living of some sort by stealing food from store or table when no one was at hand. I'm like a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and the dullest part of all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by now, by my own warm fireside, with the lamp shining. He often wished to, and he could get a message for help. He often wished too that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that of course was quite impossible. And he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneaking sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 cells in different parts of the palace. And after a time, he got to know his way about very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking and to learn that there was another dwarf in a prison too, in a specially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that that was Thorin. And after a while, he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find place when no one was about and to have a word with the chief of dwarfs. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasure and his quest, which shows how low spirited he had become. When he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole, he could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came to door and had a long whispered talk with Hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarfs, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, not before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart again, hearing how the hobbit has rescued his companions from spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in the treasure, until all hope of escaping in any other way had disappeared. Until, in fact, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he had begun to have a very high opinion indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarfs quite agreed when they got the message. They all they all thought their own shares in the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs in spite of their plight and their still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the wood elves claimed part of it, and they all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen. You see, perhaps that was a part of his reason for not going off, for his reason for going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so helpful, so hopeful as they did. He did not like being depended on by everyone, and he wished he had the wizard at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst. But no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not much good among 14. But of course, as you have guessed it, he did rescue his friends in the end, and this is how it happened. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under part of the lowest regions of the palace and joined Forest River some way further to the east. Beyond a steep slope out of which the main mouth opened. Okay. Where the underground watercourse came forth from hillside, there was a water gate. There, the rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from it, a portcullis could be dropped right to the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was often open, for a good deal of traffic went out and in by the water gate. If anyone had come in that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel leading, leading deep into heart of the hill. But at one point where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with a great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into King's cellars. There stood barrels, for the wood elves and especially their king were very fond of wine. Though no wine grew, though no wine grew in those parts, the wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinsfolk in south or from vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoors and their use. And lurking there, listening to the talk of king's servants, he learned how the wine and other goods came up the river or over the land to the long lake. It seemed a town of men still through there, built out on bridges far into the water as a protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pulled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded on to flat boats. When the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened a water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbling along, until they were carried by current to a place far down the river, where the bank jutted out near to the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town. Which stood close to the point where Forest River flowed onto Long Lake. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate and wondered if it could be used for escape of his friends. And at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passages, talking, taking the torchlight with them, and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. Now come with me, he said, and taste the new wine that had just come in. I shall be hard at work tonight, cleaning the cellars of empty wood. So let us have a drink first to help the labor. Very good, laughed the chief of the guards. I will test with you and see if it is fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff. When he heard this, Bilbo was all in flutter, for he saw that the luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at a table on which two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy. But this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorvinion, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feast only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon, the chief guard nodded his head, and he laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on, talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice. But soon his head too nodded to the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then crept Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth. In spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink and clank, which put him all in tremble. First, he unlocked Balin's door and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad as he was to get out of his wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions and know what Bilbo was going to do and all about it. No time now, said Hobbit. You just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape or none. And this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next. With chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue, there is don't argue, there is a good fellow. Then off he went from door to door until his following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble, what with the dark and what with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time one of them bumped into another, or grunted or whispered in the dark. Drat this dwarvish racket, he said to himself. But all went well and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far down in a deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. Upon my word, said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends. Gandalf spoke true as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. I am sure we are all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next? Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea, as far as he could, but he did not feel at all sure how the dwarfs would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too, for certain, they muttered. We thought you had got some sensible notion when you managed to get hold of keys. This is a mad idea. Very well, said Bilbo with downcast and also rather annoyed. Come along back to your nice cells, and I will lock you all in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try. That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way into upper halls or to fight their way out of the gates that closed by magic. and it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So, following the hobbit down in the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door through which a chief guard and butler could be seen, still happily snoring with smiles upon their faces. The wine of Dorvinian brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his bed. That will save him some of the trouble he is in for, said Bilbo to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow and quite decent to prisoners. It will puzzle them all too. They will think we had a very strong magic to pass through all those locked doors and disappear. Disappear. We have got to get busy very quick if that is to happen. Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into the adjoining cellar with trapdoors. There was little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get empty barrels through the doors into stream. These were in fact already standing in the rows in the middle of the floor waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these there were not much use as they could not easily be opened at the end without a deal of noise. Nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others which had been used for bringing other stuffs, butler, butter, apples, and all sort of things to King's palace. They soon found 13 with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and as they climbed in, the dwarfs thought anxiously of the shaking and the bumping they would get inside. Though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack them in as cozily as could be managed in a short time. At last, 12 dwarfs were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble and turned and twisted in the tub and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his air holes and said he was stiffing even before his lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could do to close holes in the sides of the barrels and to fix all the lids as safely as could be managed, and now he was left alone again, running around putting the finishing touches to the packing and hoping against hope that his plan would come off. It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came the sound of voices and flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. Where is old Galleon, the butler? Said one. I haven't seen him at the tables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what is to be done. I shall be angry if old Slowcoach is late, said another. I have no wish to waste time down here while the song is up. Ha ha, came a cry. Here is old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast all to himself and his friend the captain. Shake him, wake him, shouted the others impatiently. Galleon was not at all pleased at being shaken or wakened, and still less at being laughed at. You're all late, he grumbled. Here am I, waiting and waiting down, here while you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from weariness. Small wonder, said they, when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. Come, give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall too. No need to wake up Turkey yonder. He has had his share by